Thank you, Pat. Yes, is it?
Just a 2 seconds. Somebody who had to leave wanted to announce that if you want to do a morning swim, come up to the land at 7 a.m.
Okay. Now, we have an opportunity, thank you. We have an opportunity to have questions. So come on back up. And I think people can line up here the way we did it last night. And I think that worked really well. So come on up, who has questions? I'm sure there are plenty of questions in this audience. Come on up here. And I'll just get the ball rolling because there's just one behind me. So my sense of an important question is, how do we get greater responsibility of our own government in this? Oh, I'm sorry, that was just set up. Is that out of your way? I can move that. I'll move that. Yeah, just shut that. I'm not all the wrong one. Okay. That's all right. That's all right. So the question is, how do we get the responsibility of our own government in this? How do we get? Here's the right to food. We have a sense that this right, when I've talked to constitutional lawyers about the issue of the right to food, I get the universal response that there is no way that the right to food could be enacted by the United States because it takes a special act and that's not ever going to happen. In other words, there's no kind of, it's sort of like the Bill of Rights and the right to food couldn't be added to that because in fact that would never pass in the United States. So we need the next best things, and the question is, what are they, and how do we make some significant contribution in that direction, if we can?
Okay, so very good question, and for those of you who haven't looked at the article that Mark J. Cohen and I did for Hunger Notes, that was kind of an advisory for the Obama administration and for the new Congress that came in 2009. We looked at the right to food and what were the complaints, what was the opposition like, because both of us have been very much involved in promoting the right to food. The right to food is a reference point. And the political response was that it's not in our Constitution. Well, it's not in our Constitution. Most constitutional lawyers would accept that, and but then some of them would argue that the right to food is part of the right to life. But I think that's a stretch in terms of our American legal position. The second argument was political, and the political argument was that the U.S. has its food politics on a food security basis, and the right to food countries are countries that are socialist, and socialism is not our system, not our political system. And there the response usually is, well, hungry people isn't part of our political system either. That's not particularly our political value. And the freedom from want, that was one of the 4 freedoms that Franklin Delano Roosevelt made really essential in talking about our country and its values, said freedom from want really is a freedom that is part of our essential American values. But those who persist in thinking that the right to food is socialist, communist, that's going to be will continue to be an obstacle. And until people can embrace the right to food as freedom from hunger, hunger is not an American, anti-hunger is an American value. Hunger is not an American value. Until that conversation can be changed, that will be an obstacle. The third was the economic argument. The right to food is all about feeding all hungry people. We can't afford that. That's the opposition. The pro-argument is that helping people to feed themselves, to respect, protect, not just fulfill the right to food, certainly is and should be part of our economic development policy, both at home and abroad, and is, in the long run, is cost effective. So I think that's a very strong argument to make. And the fourth is the sociocultural argument, where the opposition says we don't want nanny government. You know who those people are. You know, there's the congressman from Iowa and others. They don't want nanny government. They want, pick yourself up by your bootstraps. as an American value, and we see working against hunger as an American value. So those are the four arguments. In terms of the legal argument, which is the way you phrased it, I wouldn't pursue the legal argument per se, except on the way the legal argument has worked in the US has been on a civil political rights basis of non-discrimination. So that if people are being excluded from government programs, whether they're work training programs, any kind of anti-poverty programs, on the basis of their ethnic, religious, political, geographic context, then that's a non-discrimination basis, and that has to be pursued very, very rigorously. Otherwise, I certainly take a substantive approach. I take a substantive approach, and I say, the way in which one can achieve the right to food substantively is by taking actions towards social justice, making sure that your food is not produced by slave labor, forced labor, underpaid labor. Make sure that the products that you choose are those that have been traded fairly. These are some of the substantive actions that one can take, and I think they're very important because individual substantive actions do build cultural and economic change.
Thank you. I just wanted to make one other response, or to emphasize one dimension that you talked about. I don't have any disagreement with what you said, but what I would like to do is to underline the current health care program, the Obama health care program, it's so-called, or the health, I'm blocking on the act, the name of the act right now, but the, what? Affordable Care Act, thank you. The Affordable Care Act is functioning to also to save money. And we heard last night that the enormous cost of obesity has yet to hit the system because it's at a very relatively young age compared to the rest of the population. So we have two tracks going. We have, on the one hand, the FDA, which, the USDA, that has the Farm Bill in it, and we have the Affordable Care Act. And these two camps do never get together. There's very little connection between the two in any kind of policy direction, so that all the money being looked at right now, and all the research going on, et cetera, is around the medical system. And all this is in a different system, in a different track. And what my question is then, economically, if we were able to prevent some of this, there's a tremendous cost savings, if you will, in a society that's very interested in saving, in preventing those conditions to grow even worse and totally swamp the Affordable Care Act in the future. We can almost project the dates, in fact, demographically, and that hasn't been done yet. So in other words, if we looked at the demographic change in the aging process of those who are now obese as kids, how is that going to track into the future and swamp the entire system? So my point is that maybe the right to food needs to be sold on the economic basis, as you suggest, at least has some strength.
Yeah, and you, I would say get in touch with Zeke Emanuel and his group.
I am.
Yeah. Okay. All right, he's included now. Yeah. Anita.
Well, Ellen, I'd like to thank you for a most articulate presentation, and your comments did connect a lot of the dots for me anyway. I have 3 questions.
Yes, please.
Okay. You talked about the fact that 65 years have gone by since the 1948 declaration, and until new declarations have been formed, and I'm not sure I can quote the exact name of these declarations, but my question to you about them is, how explicit are any of the new legal structures and structures? How explicit are they in terms of including, let's say, the poor, gender, vulnerable groups, and the kinds of categories of persons that were not covered very well or were covered very generically in the 1948 Declaration. And I'm reminded of a number of measurements originally coming from Malawi, and I was talking to some people today who had been to Malawi and a couple that have just come back from Malawi. And there's a very famous study on labor and work and payment measurements. And let me just tell you the equation, because fractional citizens is really the point that I'm getting to, and I love your concept of that. I mean, I don't love the fact that it exists, but I like the terminology. In these labor studies, by the way, if you look at one of my books on Malawi, you'll see that I calculated labor and work and food and so forth and land 3 ways, counting each person as a person, 1.0. And then using these other configurations, let me just tell you what they were. It was either 0.67 of an hour is a woman, unless she's a hired laborer, and then she was 1.0. A man was 1.0 if he was a farm owner. A hired male was 1.2. Occasionally, females were counted as 0.5. So if you were trying to figure out who produced the agriculture and what the yields were, and related to the number of household members and the number of household members who had worked on each particular kind of task, all these data were published and accounted for by the Farmington study, by not the same Farmington as in some other studies, but a particular British accountant who had that labor accountancy. And then I decided to use it in my gender analysis for Malawi to see what it turned out to be. And women, even if I counted them at 0.5, the absolute lowest, did so very much. So this idea of the fractional citizen, has that been taken into account? That's my question. The fractional citizen not being fractionalized anymore in the new conventions. That's the first one. The second, I guess, is a very easy question to say.
Wait, that was still part of the first question?
Yeah.
Oh dear. All right.
The second one is how replicable is the situation in Brazil? I mean, that's a marvel of the organization of, civil society and NGOs and rock stars and all those good things, and the willingness of government to go along with it and not put a stop to it. So how replicable is that? And then my third question, would you kindly say a little bit more about measurements? Because you talked about outcomes, and you talked about processes and projections and transformations, but in terms of how some of those things are measured on a consistent basis, I don't know if there's anything that comes to the fore that is replicable or at least used in multiple cases, or are we still at country by country?
Okay, great questions. Thank you so much. And also, I should respond to the question you asked me the opening evening, where you said, well, what about these countries that have different cultural ideas of who is a human being, or different cultural ideas of what obligations should be. And for example, they say males and females in our religious tradition are not equivalent, and that we say that our religious law should take precedence over this so-called universal human rights law. These are very serious issues that you've also raised. So how specific are the categories? I think the question that I'm raising in addition, which was an original question with you, for which I thank you, are that every country should be increasingly producing national food security plans. Now, they had to do this for the International Conference on Nutrition in 1992. They had to do this for the World Food Summit in 1996. The updates to those conferences also have national food security plans, and they are supposed to be consistent with the UN guidelines that are negotiated in these various declarations. So what does this mean in practice? That should be the next question, the implementation. And what we see is that there is a lot of activism by nutritionists, by food security personnel, by the World Food Program. The World Food Program is also very active. There's a lot of competition among the UN agencies on some of these questions, as well as among the bilateral agencies. And what they are looking at categories by age. The children under 5 And the infants and children under 1, these are very special categories that receive special attention in all the nutritional planning. The issue of different areas for agriculture, rural areas and urban areas, they do receive special attention in a lot of these plans. What my colleagues and I who work on human rights find is the most important thing, though, is to think about these plans on a human rights basis rather than simply on a food security basis. This is really the most important thing that we work on. And how are they different? How are they different? If you look at a food security plan, there was a human rights group in Haiti before the earthquake that was looking at these issues. They were saying, okay, Haiti has a food security plan. It was miserable. And then they did a rights-based plan as an alternative to that. There is a similar set comparison for Malawi that we should probably look at together and talk about a little bit more. But the rights-based plan is looking at issues such as exclusion. It's looking not only at the vulnerable groups from a nutritional standpoint, but also looking at the political, geographic, ethnic, and religious categories, and are they included or excluded. And from an anthropological standpoint, I'm sure you'll agree that this is very important to look at these issues, but they're very controversial within the countries where the governments are producing these plans, because governments often do not want to admit that there's any ethnic divisions or any discrimination going on. So, for example, professionals who work now in Rwanda, you can't ask about political, geographic, ethnic, religious exclusion because officially there are no differences. You absolutely can't bring that up. You'll be thrown out of the country or thrown in jail because officially there are no differences. So, these are some of the concerns there. But you also provide the opportunity then to say there are two systems that are competing for influence on food security and other issues. One of them is the Millennium Development Goals, which sets certain kinds of nutritional and food security goals, health goals, education goals, gender goals, international cooperation goals. And they are all very precise in their measurements. The World Bank, the UN Development Program are spending enormous resources working on indicators. So that's where you find all the measurements. And then on the other side, you have the human rights people that say, well, the legal basis for talking about how we get to these outcomes is through these universal human rights, these human rights treaties, not universal human rights treaties, but these political human rights treaties. And so really, what the human rights people who don't have good indicators should do is they should link up with the Millennium Development Goals people who only have indicators but have no legal framework, and we should work together. It's a great idea. It's not just, but they're different political fiefdoms, and so it's very difficult to get them to work in practice. So that actually speaks also then to your measurements questions. One would have to look at which series of measurements we're looking at and whether they're covered by the Millennium Development Goals. So you're shaking your head no. But that's an issue. I think we should come up with a new term. By the way, when you look at the labor payment function, I think that's really important. The 0.67 hours of a woman, I think that's really important. I think we should call it fracting. All right, next please.
Debbie Miller. I appreciate your saying that the United States Constitution does not guarantee freedom from hunger. It also doesn't guarantee profit maximization for corporations, but the apologists for oligarchy in America, who have always been active, have worked diligently over the past 40 years, creating expensive think tanks and buying the media in order to make that the frame that everybody talks in. So it's been about 40 years, I remember, since Sam Ervin gave this wonderful stump speech on American democracy at the time of the Watergate hearings, but it's been downhill for issues like social justice and food hunger issues since then. But what are the grassroots efforts that you see to use, as you said, the creative power of embarrassment, among other things, as leverage to begin changing that frame so that we can undermine that view that profit maximization is an absolute American right and everything else pales in contrast. I mean, I think we may be at a peak now of that kind of value system, and it's starting to erode. But I would love to hear what you see as particular movements that are making that change in values happen.
Thank you. I could add to that not only profit maximization, but price volatility is an American value because people make money as a result of the price volatility. Some prices are volatile, somebody's making money. The anti-World Bank, anti-global international financial institution movement, 50 years is enough, I think really focused a lot of energy, a lot of grassroots energy in the 1990s and 2000s on these issues. I think those networks are still active. Global Exchange was one of the leadership there, was very active in these works. But I think right now there's probably more energy in some of the very well-organized non-government NGOs, Corporate Responsibility International, campaigns that are focused on particular issues such as labor rights violations, which are very, very important in terms of campus activism on human rights, particularly labor rights, child labor issues, slavery issues. Corporate Responsibility International is very active on water and food issues, where they're trying to develop campaigns that do have these large corporations quite upset because these are companies that lost a lot of money fighting unsuccessfully the tobacco suits. And I think they are trying to make some changes on these issues. I think there has to be a great deal of energy on mobilizing campus youth. I think that's where some of these changes will take place. Certainly, they are the ones who have rallied around fair trade issues, trying to, the campus movements for trying to do farm to table. There's increasingly very good analyses of what's going on there. So it could be a major focus for looking at some of these issues, including local food, organic food, environmental sustainability. I think there is a lot of energy out there. I would look at the younger generation for some of these issues, and then I would also look at the older generation for some of these issues as the population moves into senior citizenship, exercising those citizenship rights through senior organizations.
I would add that the campus, if there is an equivalent to it in this age of escalating tuition fees, as becoming more online, whatever that will look like.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Wonderful presentation. I'm Edmund Robinson, and but the lawyer in me gets bothered a bit. I have spent a lot of time in my life advocating human rights and civil rights. I was active with the ACLU for about 30 years. And we sort of took it in that organization that the procedural rights contained in the U.S. Constitution would be better defended if we did not expand them to the substantive rights of food, shelter, income. And that's a philosophy which is, of course, debatable. The conceptual part, it seems to me, I remember back in law school many, many decades ago, there was a legal philosopher named Austin who said that every right has a concomitant duty, that you don't have in its system of legal rights, you have every actor that has a right has a concomitant duty. And the question is, if you say there's a right to food, who has the duty to provide that food? The only obvious answer to that is the governmental unit, I suppose.
Well, that's the obvious answer. Can I respond? Or
yes.
That's the philosopher Henry Shue wrote a very important book on human rights, particularly focusing on subsistence rights. And the context for that book was looking at U.S. policy in Central America during the civil wars of the 1980s. And he was looking at those issues. And he was the one who said for there to be a right, there must be a corresponding duty. So that there must be a right not to deprive, to protect from deprivation, and to fulfill. I mean, we looked at those duties and who would assume them. The very impressive aspect of the way in which human rights legal scholarship is proceeding in the office of the Special Rapporteur is that he and his predecessor was Asbjørn Egge, a very important Norwegian international human rights lawyer, who happened to be married to a very activist nutritionist, so they were really a dynamic duo on the right to food. Asbjørn and Wenche Barth-Eide. They've been very important in trying to chart the respect, protect, fulfill. They also added a facilitate dimension in terms of who should do it. Should it be civil society? Should it be the private sector? Should it be government? If so, government at what level? Should it be labor unions? So these boxes are being filled in, and they're being filled in not only at this international human rights official bureaucratic level, and you can read all of those documents, but it's being fulfilled by those in national and subnational units who are working with these international lawyers to be thinking as carefully and as clearly as they can about what should be the specific obligations of government, what should be the specific obligations, the do's and the don'ts for the corporations, what should be the do's and don'ts for the civil society organizations, and all of these very general declarations that come, and plans of action that come out of the international world summits on food and nutrition. They also have very explicit plans and recommendations for the civil society, recommendations for communities, the recommendations for the local government, the recommendations for the subnational governments, and so on. So they really are thinking in terms of the who should do it category. It's certainly not all about government.
Thank you. That makes me feel a lot better about it.
I don't want to overload with legal things, but I did want to make a couple of comments on the legal issue. I think that it must be the case that the constitutional lawyers that you have consulted have said that there is zero chance of getting a ruling under the Constitution of the United States as it exists to find the right to not be hungry, and I would agree with that. It is not the case that it would be unconstitutional to amend the Constitution for that purpose. There is one provision in the Constitution that cannot be amended without unanimous consent of all the states, and that's the right of the states to equal representation in the Senate. Now, of course, as a political matter, it is exceedingly unlikely, I would have to say, that you could get the political will to amend the Constitution, but it would not be unconstitutional to do so. There are other issues that are difficult when you put that kind of a substantive right into the Constitution, because the issue then becomes who has the ability to enforce it, and the ability of courts to force the political branches to honor a substantive right like that in a Constitution is difficult. You come up against that when you see things like state Supreme Courts ordering the state legislatures to honor a state constitutional provision to have a certain kind of provision for education. And similar kinds of provisions. We're running up against that in Michigan now, where you've got an issue as to whether or not, under the Michigan Constitution, Detroit can file for bankruptcy if it would diminish the pensions, because there's a provision in the Michigan Constitution that says that the pensions are guaranteed and cannot be abrogated. And those are very difficult political issues. What is definitely not problematic is statutory law, which provides for things like food stamps or similar provisions. And of course, there we've got the issue that it is open to political amendment, as we have seen in the latest action by the House of Representatives in agriculture.
Right. Thank you so much, because you then give me an opportunity to talk about a couple of other issues that I think will help clarify some of these frameworks for everyone. First, if in terms of the constitutional issues in the U.S., it's Mr. Sunstein, who just got some other political appointment in the Obama administration, who really has been looking at the rights basis for economic rights in the U.S. And so if you want to read more, you can read his responses. But I agree with you that the strategy here would be more effectively strategy of legal amendment, and it probably is not a reasonable political strategy, even though that would be the legal strategy of choice. But I want you to know that Mexico, the activists on food nutrition, on food security, on food self-reliance, Mexico had an extremely active and well-organized group, and Mexico now has an amendment to the Constitution establishing the right to food. Now, what does this mean in practice? I think what it means is that all of the advocates for better and more thoughtful and comprehensive and nuanced assistance to agriculture for small farmers now have a constitutional basis on which to argue for these programs. They now have that reference point, and that's very important for them. It's also very important for other activists, particularly in Latin American countries, to understand how they did it, who was involved, why was the program socioculturally so important, how did they organize the symbols of the Mexican Revolution and of corn and of beans. You know, Mexico is corn. Mexicans are not Mexicans without corn, nor are they Mexicans without, we're talking about beans too. That's the way they made this appeal, and they were highly effective. What outcomes will result in terms of the food security and the nutrition programs remain to be seen, but they did follow that amendment on legal strategy. In our own country, I think many of us emphasize not just the question of maintaining budgets for people who are economically disadvantaged and need access to the supplemental food assistance programs and other programs, but we also look at the entitlements structure and how those entitlements, who's eligible, not only how much are they getting, but who's eligible under what terms. There's a lot of tinkering and negotiation that always goes on there. The principal agency in the U.S. who works on that tinkering, the tinkering in that food legislation is the Food Research Action Center, FRAC, and they are the ones who originally sued the government, the USDA. They sued the office of the USDA. They sued the directors of some of the state agricultural departments in order to fully implement the law of what was then food stamps from 1970 to 1974, and also women infant child feeding programs. They did that action up to the level of the Supreme Court. They won their cases. That's how these programs were implemented through the courts. That was very important. It was a civil political rights basis because there was discrimination. They could show there had been discrimination, that whole sections of whole states were being denied access to programs, and they were able to say, to make their case on a civil political rights basis. So looking at these entitlement structures is very important. The group that looks at the financial aspects, the process, is the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities in Washington. And those were people who back in the 1960s had been in the government. They were in the Johnson government, and when the Republicans took over the White House, they then became the non-government organization that had the expertise to really look at the costs of the programs and to do the cost-benefit analyses. The reason our programs cannot be viewed as human rights programs, even though they are food security programs, is because all of the programs are negotiated on an offset budgetary basis, not on a human rights basis. So that's the basic difference. So sorry for so much legal jargon here, but when we think about our U.S. programs, which we'll be thinking about in greater intensity tomorrow morning, then we should be thinking about the budgetary process as well as the legal structures and the outcomes and the way in which the budgetary offsets are negotiated, which is certainly front and central in the current negotiations, or let's just call them fights, over the Farm Bill.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a very complete evening and understanding and increasing our understanding of that whole dimension that we need to be grappling with this week. So this has been a great introduction to it, and more than just an introduction, it's actually moving the whole argument ahead. So
Can I just make one sort of
Yeah.
closing appeal?
please.
And that is, I had told Saul that I really wanted to talk about where we are and in terms of our thoughts about spiritual, about our moral commitments and our material advances or backsliding as a way to grapple with both a science and a religious approach to understanding creativity, agricultural creativity connected to biotechnology. I haven't had time to do that, and I have proposed that I'll lead an open university forum on Friday at 1, in which we will talk about some of these issues, look at theological concepts of self-limitation of God from Christian, Jewish, and whatever other frameworks we can think about. I've been told that's a really busy time, but I hope I'll see some of you there, because I do have a whole other presentation on those issues, and I'd love to discuss them. So thank you.
Thank you. I think we may have to adjust that time because that's a time for memorial service, and I'm not sure we want to be in competition with that. Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so until we, and I don't think we're going to change that. However, we certainly will work to make sure that that does happen, that a connection does happen, and we just lost one of the connections to this. Rena, if you could come and help me get this projector working, we'll go right to the next step for a few minutes and start the biotechnology. I don't know how long that thing is going to take to reboot. So let me tell you who Sir Brian Heath is. He is the former, I'll speak into the microphone. He's the former Secretary of the Royal Academy. That's the equivalent of the National Academy of Sciences in the UK. He's currently been the former Master of Clare College at Cambridge University, and was knighted by the Queen about 10 years ago for all of his work in science and religion too. So he's very active in the science and religion community. He was one of the founding presidents of the International Society of Science and Religion. And currently he serves as the chair of the Scientific Advisory Committee for the EU, the European Union. So, and he has a specific special interest in genetically modified food. So he agreed to talk with me, and he agreed to talk, and he talked and he talked. So, so my point is it's a little longer, and we'll have to stretch it over more than one thing if I can get this thing to work. Oh, here it is. We'll see whether this is our focus.
You made a press, so you have it exactly. Okay, so how do how many copies do you think you'd like?
Oh.
I would say, why don't we say 25?
Guess what? He said 50. 50 copies of his book are in this room.
I said 50, yeah. Okay.
Okay. That was the end. That's
Sure,
the,
50 people will keep it.
that's not.
Something this weekend coming.
That's not the right.
Have to be sent to them, I think. Let me give you their address. In fact, I'll email you their address so you have it exactly. Okay. So I'll email you that. How many copies do you think you'd like? Oh, I would say, why don't we say?
There's more than one. I'm sorry. This is brand new to do this, so I just have to find the right file. I think it's the one below this one. Please. I don't know why I didn't notice this one.
Yeah, I'm very excited to read what you're doing with the EASAC, the European
This is.
Organization for Scientific Advisory.
Can you see that all right?
They can hear that.
I'll turn up the sound.
There's a clear, consistent message in the scientific community about GM-ologies, etc. And I wondered if you want to start by just giving me a sense of what you've done in that area with regard to the research and ESAC, the European Academy of Science Advisory Council, we set it up just over 10 years ago. Scientists in Europe were concerned that they wanted to be able to provide more direct evidence for policymakers in Brussels and in Strasbourg. It's had some considerable success, and the purpose of it is to look at ways in which one can provide the evidence base for policymakers who are not necessarily themselves scientists, and also from time to time to challenge them as to whether their policies are really evidence-based. And as you can imagine, the GM crop issue, being such a sensitive one in Europe, is a classic example of how scientists want policymakers to facilitate their process of developing the situation in Europe. Now, if you will know, genetic modification of crops is something, of course, that has been going on for thousands of years. There's nothing particularly new in that. What's new about it, of course, is the method by which you operate. And the mechanisms that have been developed in recent years have been very successful. Some of them have led to the ability to introduce a single gene from either the same species or from a different species or a different variety into a plant, and to have it expressed because it has characteristics and qualities that are of value, either for the plant itself or for the product that it produces, particularly in the field of food. Now, over the last 25 years, particular interest has developed because not only is it possible to transfer a single gene, but it's now possible to transfer several genes that will confer benefit on the plant or the crop in question. And these are called stacked genes. And more recently still, and this is the purpose of our recent work with ESAC, it's been possible not only to introduce the gene itself, but to modify the existing gene by targeting a particular nucleotide in the gene that is present in the plant itself. And these advanced techniques, which are now very sophisticated, are going to introduce a whole new way of how one might actually bring about plant breeding.
That's extremely exciting in terms of the perspective, and of course, many of these technologies are still in development, and in fact, the overall technology is accelerating in its capacity to be much more specific than the original technologies that are out there.
Yes, exactly. That's exactly right. And if we just reflect for a moment on one of the great names from Cambridge some 200 years ago, that is Thomas Malthus, who wrote his famous essay, in which he was doubtful whether in fact the human race was able to survive because with increasing numbers it would outstrip the rate at which we could produce food. Of course, what Malthus didn't appreciate and couldn't appreciate at that time was the massive improvement and increase in scientific knowledge that enabled plant breeders in particular to start producing food and crops in a totally different way. And it is because of the skills of the plant breeders, the availability of fertilizer, herbicides, that it's possible to keep pace with the human population growth rate, and also to make sure that we do have sufficient food. Of course, the challenge now is that over the next 25 to 50 years, the population is going to increase even further, and consequently the challenge is going to be even greater to meet the demands of everybody. At present, as you know, we produce enough food for everybody if it was distributed evenly throughout the world. And of course, that's not possible, and very often the food that's available is not the right sort of food for people who live in different parts of the world. So it's a complex situation, but with the new development, science and technology, there is greater hope that it's going to be able to, we are going to be able to meet those challenges. Added to that, of course, we have the whole problem of climate change. And the new technologies do offer some hope that it will be possible to improve the variety in such a way that providing resistance to the hostile environments that occur in certain parts of the world, which at present, of course,
parts of the world already.
Yeah, that's a really important observation, of course, and oddly enough, your comments strike right to the heart of where I'm going to be starting, which is all this is concept and the carrying capacity and that whole theme. So we're on the same wavelength completely with respect to my personal take on this. So now, one of the things that's happened, of course, in the area, maybe one of the reasons, in a sense, the EU is not at the same level of development as is in other parts of the world, including the United States, is because there's been a lot of negative opposition toward the perspective. And I wanted to know from your point of view, how that is changing and how it got to be. You know, I think it's really important that we deal with that because honestly, I see that growing in the United States.
Yes, it is an extraordinary situation that we have where at the moment in the USA, GM crops are grown extensively, in Europe hardly at all. In Europe we have stem cell research, particularly in the UK. In the USA you have reservations about the use of embryonic stem cells. So there are some really important and fascinating cultural differences and religious differences that come to bear because of this type. Let me give you a couple of figures. Last year, some 17 million farmers grew GM crops on 170 million hectares of land. So it's not something that's being done in a corner, it's something that's very widespread in many countries these days. In addition, for the first time last year, the amount of land that was grown with GM crops was greater in developing countries than in developed countries. So that's another remarkable landmark. But still we have this situation where Europe is quite isolated. And I want to link it, of course, with African countries, which we can talk about in a moment. I came across a paper a couple of days ago which gave an interesting quote of an analysis which has been done of, if you put in a search term into Amazon of agricultural biotechnology, and you look under the criterion popular and new, you will find amazingly that out of the top 40 books, there is only one single book that was not anti-biotechnology. And that is the book called Tomorrow's Table by Ronald and Adam Chang. And I think it indicates to us that we have a very serious problem in Europe because writing books against GM crops has become a shortcut to celebrity status in the mass media. And the person who has written this paper comes from Switzerland and has done a very careful analysis. So why I think we've got ourselves into this situation. There have been serious reservations about when we come to ask the ethical questions about GM crops. For example, are they safe? The answer to that is yes, they are safe. Are they fair? The answer to that is yes, they are fair, provided you take into consideration making this technology available to less advantaged parts of the world. Are they natural? Well, what is natural these days? So much has changed from the very start of agriculture. We changed the species and the varieties very considerably. Now, the one that is a real difficulty for Europe, or was a difficulty, is the fourth hurdle, what has become known as the fourth hurdle. Is it needed? And of course, when this technology was first introduced into Europe, much of it, incidentally, was invented here. Many people think it was invented in the USA, but a lot of the original work was actually done in the UK and in Germany. And when they were asking the question 20-25 years ago, is it needed, we had huge excess of cereals and grain in Europe. We had huge excess of milk. And people said, well, why do we need these new technologies to produce even more food and even more milk? So that was the start of it. But I think there's another very interesting area that I like to refer to, because I was personally involved some 20 years ago in the Advisory Council on Biotechnology, which advised the President of the European Union, Jacques Delors. The Green Movement was very strong, and I noticed, particularly in discussions with Germans, that the German representatives were extremely negative about GM technology because it touched on the issue of genetics. Never again would they contemplate the prospect or the possibility that genetical experiments might be done in Europe with the nature that were carried out under the Third Reich. And I think we often forget that there is a very deep-seated negativity about genetical aspects in Europe, which has been quite difficult to overcome.
That's a very important issue, and certainly I remember that
I'm very offended here because the candlelight is going to be starting.
the opposition